In the crisp air of a March morning in 1909, the rugged shorelines of Pauwela, Maui, Hawaii stood steadfast against the rolling waves. Ailani, a 19-year-old mother, had grown up with the sea as her constant companion. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was as familiar to her as the rhythm of her own heartbeat. As she gazed out at the endless expanse of the Pacific, she felt the salty mist settle on her skin like a gentle caress. The sky above was a tapestry of blues and grays, the clouds shifting and swirling like living creatures. The rocks at her feet were rough and jagged, yet somehow comforting in their solidity. Ailani had always been drawn to the sea, with its ever-changing moods and infinite mysteries. She had spent countless hours exploring the tide pools and watching the ebb and flow of the tides. The sea was a living thing, with a spirit and energy to her. As Ailani made her way along the rocky shorelines of Pauwela, the sun beat down on her skin, warming her and filling her with a sense of peace. She had come here to gather opihi, small shellfish that clung to the rocks at the water's edge. The sound of the waves crashing against the shore was a soothing backdrop to her work, and she hummed a tune under her breath as she searched for the perfect shell. But as she reached for one particular stubborn shell, she felt a sudden rush of water around her ankles. Before she could react, a massive wave crashed against the shore, sending her tumbling into the water. Panic set in as she struggled to find her footing, but the currents were too strong, and she was quickly pulled away from the safety of the shore. Ailani's body was at the mercy of the ocean's power, the waves crashing over her and dragging her deeper and deeper into the water. She fought to stay afloat, but the currents were unrelenting, and she was quickly losing strength. The water around her was a dizzying blur of turquoise and emerald, the sunlight filtering down in shafts of brilliant light. Despite the churning currents threatening to pull her under, Ailani's years of swimming experience served her well. Fiercely, she kicked and fought towards the surface, gasping for air as she broke through the water's barrier. But her relief was short-lived, as a sudden shadow darkened the water beneath her. All 15 feet of a massive great white shark shot towards her with lightning-fast speed, jaws gaping open to reveal its razor-sharp teeth. In a blur of terror and disbelief, Ailani watched as the monstrous predator sank its teeth into her legs, the serrated edges slicing through skin and muscle ruthlessly. Ailani tried to escape the deadly grip of the predator, but the shark's grip was too strong. Its jaws clamped shut like a vice. With a loud roar, the massive shark thrashed and twisted on the water's surface, its bulk battering Ailani like a rag doll caught in a dog's jaws. Her body was flung about with savage force, her head slamming against the water and her limbs twisting and jerking in a frenzied dance of agony. And then, with a sickening crunch, the shark's jaws closed around Ailani's legs once again. This time, however, there was no escape. The shark's teeth tore through her flesh and bones like a hot knife through butter, rending her body in two with a savage snap. As the water turned red with Ailani's blood, the shark thrashed and twisted in a frenzy of violence. Its jaws were slick with gore, and its eyes gleamed with a cold, ruthless hunger. For a moment, the world seemed to slow to a crawl, and the only sound was the terrible roar of the sea and the crunching of bone. But then, with a final shudder, the shark released its grip on Ailani's body and disappeared into the ocean's depths. The shark's hunger was insatiable, and it returned to Ailani's battered body with a ferocity that was terrifying to behold. Its jaws snapped and snashed, tearing at her flesh and bones relentlessly. It was as if the shark was determined to leave nothing behind but a pile of shattered bones and tattered flesh. And then, with a final brutal snap, the shark's teeth closed around Ailani's neck, tearing her head from her body with a sickening crunch. The sight was a horror beyond words, a violent and merciless act of nature that left no doubt about the true power of the ocean's most fearsome predator. But the shark was not yet satisfied. With a vicious snap of its jaws, it clamped onto Ailani's arm and dragged her lifeless body into the depths below, as if to claim its prize and devour it in a hidden lair. After the report of the incident, a desperate search party scoured the shoreline, their eyes scanning the dark waters of any sign of Ailani. But they found a gruesome sight that would haunt them for the rest of their days. In the choppy, churning waves, they saw a twisted mass of flesh and bone, torn apart and gnawed by the razor-sharp teeth of a fearsome predator. It was all that remained of Ailani, her body reduced to a grotesque jumble of torn flesh and shattered bone. The search party's worst fears were realized as they bore witness to the true power of the ocean's deadliest predator. They knew that Ailani had met a violent end at the hands of a merciless killer, her life cruelly snatched away by the unforgiving depths. The crisp air of a September morning in 1909 sent shivers down Jimmy's spine as he stepped onto the docks of Galveston, Texas. He was surrounded by the sounds of creaking wood and clanging metal as his crewmates worked diligently to prepare their ship for a month-long fishing journey. The shipyard was alive with activity as ropes were coiled and knots were tied precisely. Galveston, Texas was a bustling hub of commerce and industry, with its shipyard serving as the heart of the city's maritime trade. The shipyard was a maze of wooden docks and towering cranes, with ships of all shapes and sizes lining the water's edge. The air was thick with sounds of metal clanging against metal and the rhythmic thud of hammers against the wood. Men in rough work clothes scurried like ants, hauling heavy equipment and materials from one end of the yard to the other. The salty ocean breeze carried the pungent scent of fish, oil, and sweat, filling the nostrils of all who passed through the area. Aboard the ship, Jimmy lounged on the deck, soaking up the warm sun and breathing in the salty ocean air. Suddenly, a loud splash interrupted his peaceful daydreaming. He jolted upright and rushed to the edge of the ship to investigate. His heart leaped in his throat as he saw his crewmate Tony thrashing about in the water, screaming for help. As Jimmy peered into the murky depths, his heart pounding with fear, he could see Tony struggling to stay afloat and injured from the impact. Without hesitation, Jimmy sprang into action, grabbing a life buoy and jumping overboard to save Tony from the treacherous waters. As Jimmy swam towards Tony, the other crew members watched from above, their hearts in their throats. Suddenly, a dark figure loomed beneath the surface, sending shivers down their spines. They knew all too well the dangers lurking in the ocean's depths, and they feared for Jimmy and Tony's safety. Finally, Jimmy reached Tony and expertly fastened the life buoy around him. He signaled to the crew members above to hoist them back onto the ship, and they pulled with all their might. The strain of the effort was evident on their faces as they struggled to bring Jimmy and Tony to safety. As the crew members frantically worked to hoist Jimmy and Tony out of the water, a monstrous creature suddenly exploded out of the waves with terrifying force. It was a massive 14-foot bull shark, its powerful jaws wide open, menacingly showcasing its serrated teeth. The shark moved with lightning-fast speed, lunging towards Jimmy with deadly intent. In an instant, it had clamped its jaws down on his leg, its sharp teeth tearing through flesh and muscle. Jimmy's agonized scream pierced the air, a blood-curdling sound that echoed throughout the shipyard. The shark thrashed in the water, dragging Jimmy with it as it continued its brutal attack. Blood stained the ocean around them, a macabre display of the shark's ferocity and Jimmy's suffering. The crew members watched in horror as the shark mauled its victim into submission, its strength and power overwhelming. They knew they had to act quickly if they wanted to save Jimmy's life, but as they looked on helplessly, they couldn't help but wonder if it was too late. Despite his valiant efforts, Jimmy's bare hands were no match for the ferocious predator, that had clamped its vice-like grip on his legs. The water churned around them with a sickening mixture of blood, torn flesh, and salt water as the shark continued its brutal attack. Tony's eyes were fixed on the gruesome scene before him, his mind unable to comprehend the sheer brutality of the creature before him. The shark's massive jaws loomed over Jimmy's legs, ripping and tearing at the flesh with a savage and unrelenting force. The sound of the shark's teeth gnashing together filled the air, a sickening crunch that seemed to reverberate through Tony's entire body. As the moments passed, Tony felt a wave of nausea and fear wash over him, his heart pounding like a drum. He wanted to look away, shield himself from the horrors unfolding before him, but he couldn't tear his eyes away from the gruesome scene. As minutes ticked away, Jimmy's struggles became weaker and weaker, his body succumbing to the pain and trauma inflicted by the vicious predator. The shark seemed to sense its victory, determination, and strength, unyielding as it pulled Jimmy's helpless and mangled carcass deeper and deeper underwater. The crew on the ship was thrown into a state of chaos as they desperately tried to haul Tony back on board as quickly as possible. Their hearts raced with fear and anxiety, their minds reeling from the horror of what they had just witnessed. With trembling hands, they pulled Tony onto the ship's deck, their relief palpable as they saw that he was still alive. But when they looked back towards the water, their joy turned to horror as they saw nothing but a vast pool of crimson, the horrible aftermath of the shark's attack. Tony's physical injuries would eventually heal, but his psychological scars would remain with him for the rest of his days. The trauma of the brutal attack would haunt him, a constant reminder of the fragility of life and the merciless power of nature. The year was 1948, and the air was chilled with the biting November winds that swept across the waters of the coast of St. John, a small and tranquil island nestled in the U.S. Virgin Islands. Christopher Oswald had just emerged from a long and raucous night of drinking and revelry with his friends, the remnants of the alcohol still clouding his mind and making his steps unsteady. St. John, U.S. Virgin Islands coastline is a breathtaking sight to behold. Towering cliffs of jagged rock rise from the sparkling blue waters below, their rugged peaks carved and shaped by the relentless force of the sea. The waves crash against the shoreline with a mighty roar, sending sprays of white foam shooting up into the air like 1,000 tiny fireworks. But for Christopher and his friends, the beauty of the coastline meant nothing, as they could barely walk after a night of drinking. Christopher Oswald stumbled aboard the boat, reeking of alcohol and teetering dangerously on unsteady legs. The night's revelry had left him in a haze of intoxication, his thoughts muddled and his actions unpredictable. As the boat sliced through the dark waters towards their destination, the gentle lapping of the waves seemed to lull Christopher into a false sense of security. Suddenly, with a drunken laugh, he hurled himself over the boat's edge, his body plunging into the icy water below. Shocked gasps and cries rang out as his friends and the crew watched in disbelief, frozen by the sheer recklessness of Christopher's actions. Desperate to bring him back to safety, they frantically called out to him, their voices carrying over the wind and waves. But Christopher remained stubbornly in the water, his intoxicated mind convinced he was invincible. As the boat drifted aimlessly, the crew's frustration mounted by the second, one of them finally throwing a life buoy connected to a rope, hoping to coax Christopher back on board. But his drunken defiance held strong, and he refused to budge from his position in the water, his careless actions bringing their journey to an abrupt and unwanted halt. Suddenly, the tranquil waters of the night turned into chaos as Christopher's screams echoed through the boat and the surrounding sea. His friends and boat crew frantically searched for him, but their confusion turned to horror when they saw what was happening. The water around Christopher had turned into a crimson pool, and they realized with gut-wrenching dread that he was being attacked by something in the depths. The marshal's trembling hands again threw the buoy, hoping to save Christopher from whatever was dragging him down. But as soon as the buoy landed in the water, a huge bull shark emerged from the darkness, its massive jaws tearing through Christopher's flesh with terrifying power. The shark's razor-sharp teeth gnashed through Christopher's neck and shoulders, sending droplets of blood cascading through the air like a macabre fountain. The screams of Christopher and his friends mixed with the sounds of the water being torn apart by the violent shark attack. The boat rocked violently as the people tried to comprehend the horror unfolding before them. The brutal assault was a heart-stopping moment that shattered the peacefulness of the serene sea. With its powerful jaws and razor-sharp teeth, the ferocious bull shark struck with lightning speed. The gruesome attack was relentless, leaving no chance of survival for poor Christopher. As the shark clamped down on his neck and shoulders, the force of the bite was so strong that it shattered bones and tore flesh apart. Blood gushed like a fountain, staining the surrounding water in a gruesome display of violence. Screams of horror and disbelief echoed as the people on the boat witnessed the terrorizing event. They were frozen in shock, unable to move or speak, as they watched the life drain out of Christopher's body. The once vibrant man was now a lifeless limp figure, a victim of the ruthless predator. The shark's attack was brutal, and it seemed determined to inflict as much harm as possible. With a ferocity that bordered on madness, the beast lunged toward Christopher's defenseless body, its jaws clamping down on the already torn remains of his torso. The water turned into a frenzy of red as the shark whipped its prey back and forth, tearing him apart. The boat's occupants looked on in horror, powerless to intervene as the shark inflicted its brutal assault. With every passing moment, the realization sank that Christopher's fate was sealed. The shark would not let go of its prey until it had claimed its kill. Then, with a powerful pull, the shark dragged Christopher's lifeless body beneath the surface, disappearing into the ocean's murky depths. The only remnants of the tragedy were the waves of blood that continued to ripple across the water's surface, and the severed arm that floated eerily in the water, a haunting reminder of the violent attack that had just taken place. With adrenaline coursing through his veins, the captain hastily maneuvered the boat from the violent whirlpool of blood and carnage. As they sped toward safety, the passengers were shocked and in disbelief at the events unfolding. Despite the immediate report to the authorities, days and weeks of searching proved fruitless, as the body of Christopher Oswald remained elusive, lost to the dark and unforgiving depths of the ocean.